Hello, everyone, and welcome to, well, the offering for the 6th of June 2022, which is the London Naval Treaty. How could you have been made equitable for it on aircraft carriers? Okay, so, I'm going to give you a heads up now. There is going to be sarcasm in this, because this is possibly the area which is. Look, we have all discussed. I've discussed, and this has been part of this ongoing discussion on these equitable treaties, how various things have treated the Japanese and others. Now, I do understand that some people believe it's quite sensible. However, in the 1930 London Naval Treaty, it continues the joy of picking on Japan. And yes, I can understand why, but it kind of shoots everyone else in the foot. To an extent, I was actually considering adding in something into this treaty. And it is mostly over the fact that in the pursuit of stopping Japan stealing a potential march on them, even though everyone knew that the efficiencies of a carrier by this point, especially in 1930, favored the larger vessels. That fear meant they cut off the production of smaller ships. And I actually did at several points toy with the idea of adding in a small carrier category, making it part of the equitable solution. If I could honestly have come up with a way of changing it to a fleet carrier, light carrier grouping, I would have. And when I say honestly, the same criteria apply to the London Treaty and making it equitable as the Washington Treaty. It must have a basis in reality. The solution must have been aired and must have been discussed at the time. It has to be based on the criteria of what ships are in existence at the time, and it has to be sort of there as part of it. Now, honestly, there are ships existent, so I could have done that, but no one really raises it. No one raises the idea of escort carriers or convoy carriers, despite the British keep raising again the idea of getting rid of the submarine. The British know how important aviation was to the anti-submarine war in the First World War, and yet no one thinks about it. Now, there are two potential reasons why. And I say this with love in my heart for the British, but in 1930, Henderson has just been made Rear Admiral aircraft carriers. He is just getting to grips with the problem. It's a long way away from 1933 and the solutions he'll be coming up with. And again, it's one of those things. The amount of times I hear people go, well, the escort carrier comes from nowhere, or it's an idea of this merchant ship owner, or this person, or that person. And I sit there and look and go, there were studies being done about convoy protection and the conversion of merchant vessels to aircraft carrier roles a long time before war broke out, and had been going on as part of the studies for a long time. So, yeah, that's all there. So maybe, just maybe, the British were playing a sort of two-headed game. They were supporting the Americans to earn their assistance on other matters in this to put down the Japanese construction, whilst at the same time planning to pay as much notice to the rules as they would end up paying to thou shalt not purchase ships being built for another power in your yards or when war begins. ARA La Argentina just about got away in time. I swear if she'd hung around a week or two more, they'd have found a reason to keep her just in case. And if the war had broken out in Tsingtao in January 1939, she would have been part of the Royal Navy within 5 seconds flat. So where are we at the series? We're at part 2 of the London Treaties. And you get a break from the treaty series tomorrow because it goes to the Pensacola class. And then on the 8th, we go to cruisers and destroyers. And on the 10th, I have a UAD video for you, which could well be of interest. A fleet battle, maybe. If it works. Remember, very small laptop. Soups and other ships on the 11th. Fortifications on the 12th. And then be other videos coming on the 13th and 14th. And even there's a live. Yes, I kid you not. A live on this topic. And that's because of the questions already raised about it from other videos. Alive on these Equitable treaties on the 16th. Hence the overall Equitable treaty for London is the 15th. And then on the 17th, I doubt you'll see a UAD video. I have other plans for that day. And then the 18th is going to be another live. And the 19th will be a live. So I will be doing 3 lives in the week I'm back. And where am I coming back from? Canada, of course. We haven't got to there, though, in the discussion. We've got into this example of why I'm annoyed. Because this is less than 10,000 tons in standard. 8,188 long tons standard. Escort carriers. You probably wouldn't have ended up with HMS Unicorn being built if you'd been able to build light fleet carriers of less than 10,000 tons. You could have halved displacement. I think the idea I was flirting with was sort of creating roughly a 2-tier standard. Fleet carriers could be built up to 30,000 tons, and you could use 2/3 of any allotted tonnage for those fleet carriers. And light carriers could be up to 15,000 tons, and you could use 1/3 of your displacement to build those. Now, again, this gets sort of interesting going, okay, what are we going to be building? And how do we do it so it becomes divisible by them? If we're building 30,000 tons is a limit, and we're building allowed 10 of those under the treaty ratio of equivalent of 10 such carriers, you would then be allowed 200,000 tons for fleet carriers and 100,000 tons for light carriers. Doesn't quite work out with 15,000 tons being the limit, does it? And 30,000 tons being the limit. You almost need to make it 315,000 tons. Or more. You could go for, I don't know, 330,000 tons. But it all gets complicated, and you start to sort of figure out, hang on, this is going to get really, really complicated. You could go for, we're going to allow 10 of each. That was something I again toyed with. You have a maximum limit of 150,000 tons for light carriers. You have a maximum limit of 300,000 tons for fleet carriers. Knowing that if you're the Royal Navy, you will probably end up producing 25,000 ton fleet carriers and desperately trying to figure out exactly what you can do to get 12 out of the light carriers. Probably again 12,500 tons. Because that would just about work. Be interesting to see what kind of fleet would have actually been in existence by the time World War II came around, especially as you remember there's no carrier building holiday. Now, currently, as I'm speaking to you, well, from a recorded video, actually from back in the past, so hello future. I'm of course nowhere near my office. If the wings of fate have provided, I will have flitted across the Atlantic to Canada, touch wood, and I will be, as I speak to you on the 6th, I will have hopefully spent the day going to the Sullivans and the Rock. I might even be giving a public lecture as you watch this. There might even be someone in the room of the public lecture listening to this in one ear, whilst they're hearing me talk to them in the other, so they have me conflicting with me in the middle of their head as we speak. Think about it. Tomorrow, I fly to Halifax. Yay! We have nothing arranged currently in the evening, stat. Please do watch the Discord channel. If you go down below, you will find a link to it. If you wanted to meet up with us, there could be SimSec events being held in Halifax. That would be quite a lot of fun if they do have it. And then we have the Canadian the Visit Sackville, which we're at on the 8th. She's not open to the public, but we're being allowed around her. And if everyone happens to be gathering outside and want us to have a chat about it, we'll probably end up will do. But we are also next day going to do the Canadian National Archives Museum, the Atlantic, if they let us do filming. Even if they don't let us do filming, we'll probably be wandering around it because we're going to look for it. And then we're flying back to Hamilton. Then we have Obja on the Friday, which is going to be fun. I have to confirm details with them very, very actually when I'm in Canada. So I'm looking forward to that. And then it flies back to the UK. But actually doesn't fly back to the UK. Drax actually now flying home on the same flight as me. So we're both having technically a day of wandering around on the Saturday before we fly home. A bit of a rest day, public lecture, wander around. So if we haven't seen Niagara Falls, or if we want to go back to Haida, or we want to do anything, we'll be wandering around that day. Please, recommendations again, as always, for food are greatly received. And if you would like to meet up with us while we're out there, again, we love to say hi. We're very chatty people. So, I'm going to restate again because some of you will watch not all the videos. So you might not have watched the first video where I explained how I'm combining treaties. Why I'm combining the treaties. I'm combining the 1936 treaty. Doesn't really count. So I'm combining into the 1930 treaty because that's the one which really counts. The 1936 treaty is signed by these powers, but it's kind of like, how do I put this? It would be like NATO at the moment signing a treaty which said, we are not going to invest in UAVs. We're limiting our development of uncrewed systems. And then going, hang on. China, Russia, North Korea, all the other countries that potentially iffy aren't. Oh, sugar. Hence, by 1937, it sort of really doesn't exist. Apart from in theory, there are still treasuries silently trying to implement it because it saves money. But considering the official 10-year rule was cut in 1932, and they can't really. By 1937, they're sort of going, yeah, we can't really try and claim we're enforcing this. So the 1936 treaty, instead, I'm using as a bit of an idea. It's an idea to show where intent's coming from. So I've got 1930 treaty, which is quite a lot of it is stay as place. Tread water, please. To go to, well, the 1930 treaty, this is where they were trying to head for. And this is a good example of one of the carriers around the time. This is HMS Glorious. This is what she looks like. Notice the flying off deck and the flight deck. They never actually had the full length flight conversion, which they might have done. Honestly, they might have done if they'd been around for longer. I have this sneaking suspicion that if Glorious and Courageous had not met their demises through some real stupidity, and it is stupidity, let's be honest. I'll be getting into how much of stupidity the loss of Glorious's, especially Glorious and Courageous are, Glorious especially in my mind, but Courageous as well, is down to decisions further on in the treaty, and especially government's reaction decisions further on in the treaty, as the series goes on. But this is not a non-useful ship. It's carrying 48 aircraft by 1939, and if you wanted to do a full length flight deck and increase the hangar space and modernize the ship, which you could have done, adding in probably larger accelerators and probably increasing the size of some of the lifts, or at least modifying the lift space, you could have pushed that up a little bit higher. And if they'd been in service longer, Courageous and Glorious, far more than Furious, would have been viable for this. There's also the fact that if they'd been in service available around for longer and hadn't been lost, they would have been very useful in terms of application of force at critical points. Mers el Kabir, the hunt for Bismarck, the hunt for lots of little vessels, Taranto. All these things could have been dramatically different if you have another couple of carriers wandering around which can carry a decent sized air group. For starters, there's the knock-on effect that if you have those couple of carriers wandering around, you put less strain on the forces you actually do have in service. So they're useful. They're also, to an extent, benchmarks, but they're not the benchmarks. Okay? They really aren't the benchmarks. Why do I say they're not the benchmarks? Because these are by no means the largest carriers in service in the world at this point. There is the absolute gratuitous cheating going on. And I'm not talking about the Japanese. So, context that changes to treaties. How have I managed to make them more equitable? That's actually quite difficult because it's keeping it equitable but keeping it fair to history. So, Washington Treaty, I basically just made them actually retain their internal logic. I.e., their limitation they applied to cruisers, we will go to the size which is big enough to allow the biggest of the kinds that have been built, will also apply to capital ships. That is it. And I did the same with aircraft carriers. The largest we're prepared to allow in tonnage is what we will allow. I didn't want to delete the Wall Street crash. That's a big nexus point in history. But it's amazing how subtle you can start being adjusting things. You can make John Maynard Keyes, government intervention in economic situations, far more prevalent than it was and give it a boost up, and Keynesian economics. So that will encourage governments to want to spend more money. because they'll be thinking interfering better will ameliorate the impact of the Wall Street crash slightly more. And then I have a limitation because the trouble is, in both Britain and America, you have governments which are difficult from a funding Navy perspective and from going to actually push for a slightly bigger treaty perspective. In the UK, you have Ramsay MacDonald, who is a perfectly stalwart Prime Minister. And honestly, is not that much more peace orientated than Stanley Baldwin, the Conservative counterpart. But Baldwin is, well, A, he's pro the larger counties, not Exeter and York like things. B, he's not trying to save that sort of money. And C, most importantly, he does actually want to spend on defence a bit more. He's a bit more worried about the world and a bit less sure that World War One means peace is going to break out. And it's rather the same with the US. You have the case it's Hoover or Smith, and neither is pretty much a shining example of what you want to lead a country after a Wall Street crash. Neither is. Okay, I'm not going to claim either is an actually shining example of a revolutionary president. However, whereas Hoover is completely opposed to Roosevelt, Smith, at least in this period, especially when he needs Roosevelt's support to try to get the nomination and then to try and run for election, he listens to Roosevelt. Now, Roosevelt still follows the same economic advisors he has. So I decided the Smith one wins the election somehow. Maybe instead of reacting to hearing he was a Catholic and deciding they weren't going to vote for him, people decided, you know what? That's the most stupid reason not to vote for someone. Based on the idea they're going to listen to some foreign preacher. Mainly because, and I say this with all due respect, and with cousins who are from that particular part of the world as well, I have never met anyone least likely to listen to anyone else than your average American politician. Seriously. And I say this with British politicians, who are also fairly stubborn, but tend to go the reverse way and listen to everyone and say and agree with everything as they go along. Anyway, leaving that to one side, we have the London Naval Treaty. How it was negotiated. It's a room full of people having conversations. There will be the formal meetings. This is what this picture of, where people make big, grandiose statements. And the leading delegates sit at a table. Their aides, in order of seniority, sit slowly further and further away from the table behind their primaries. It's a truly humbling experience when you realize that most of the stuff is agreed in the sidebars, discussions, and quiet things going on around the formal meetings and the formal sessions, not during the formal sessions. In my experience, no one says anything in a formal session without already knowing that their allies are going to support it and having tried to put it in a way which is either going to box their opponents into a bad position or try to surprise their opponents so you can skip it past them. It's a fun 3D chess match of words, wits, and wine. So, here is the 1930 London Naval Treaty. Article 1. The high contracting parties agree not to exercise their rights to lay down the keels of capital ship replacement tonnage during the years 1931 to 36. Okay. But that doesn't mean aircraft carriers. That's just the battleships and the battle cruisers or fast battleships, depending on what you're building. So, yeah, that don't matter for us, but it's good to clear it up. There are some people who sometimes talk about this treaty era and say it's a ban on all ship production. No, it's just capital ship production. Article 3. For the purposes of the Washington Treaty, the definition of an aircraft carrier given in Chapter 2, Part 4 of the said treaty is hereby replaced by the following definition. The expression aircraft carrier includes any surface vessel of war, whatever its displacement, designed for the specific and exclusive purpose of carrying aircraft and so constructed that aircraft can be launched therefrom and landed thereon. The fitting of a landing on or the flying off platform or deck on a capital ship, cruiser, or destroyer, provided such vessel was not designed or adapted exclusively as an aircraft carrier, shall not cause any vessel so fitted to be charged against or classified in the category of aircraft carriers. No capital ship in existence on the 1st of April 1930 shall be fitted with a landing on platform or deck. Okay. Again, the fear of the battle carrier is rising, because you're gonna hear more of this as we go on. Article number 4. No aircraft carrier of 10,000 tons, that's 10,116 metric tons, or less, the stand displacement, mounting a gun above 6.1 inch caliber shall be acquired by or constructed by or for any of the high contracting parties. Now, no aircraft carrier of 10,000 tons or less. Standard displacement. Mounting a gun above 6.1 inch caliber shall be acquired by or constructed by or for any of the high contracting parties. That's sort of a cruiser carrier, I suppose. Mounting a gun above 6.1 inch. Basically, it's saying you can't build anything in the cruiser realm, but it goes further down than that. As from the coming into force of the present treaty in respect to all the high contracting parties, no aircraft carrier of 10,000 tons or less stand displacement, mounting guns above 6.1 inch caliber, shall be constructed within the jurisdiction of any of the high contracting parties. That's kind of saying the same thing twice over. And before you start worrying, Alex, you're repeating yourself, there is a lot of that in this treaty. There is a lot of that in the 1930 Naval Treaty. I mean, it is honestly one of the more interesting treaties in terms of its repetition. And it's quite obsessive with making sure you understand points. And as said, this is basically Article 4, points 1 and 2 pretty much repeat each other. And the emphasis is you will not be building aircraft carriers that are below 10,000 tons. We don't want them. Now, you can go, well, hang on, I can't build something which is 10,000 tons with a gun above 6 inches. So, yeah, I can still build it. But I've created enough of an area of difficulty that I'm not quite sure. They can't acquire, construct, or for any of the high contracting parties, and shall not, and they can't be constructed within the jurisdiction of any of the high contracting parties. Well, they just said that twice. What's it meaning? It's basically meaning you can't get away with saying no 10,000 ton carriers at all, but you can make it pretty much impossible for you to build them without feeling like you're breaking the treaty and giving treasuries and a lot of people who are trying to err on the side of political safety pause for thought. Now, Article 5. An aircraft carrier must not be designed and constructed for carrying of more powerful armaments than that authorized by Article 9 or Article 10 of the Washington Treaty or by Article 4 of the present treaty. So they're all limited to 6.1 inch guns. Wherever in the said Articles 9 and 10 the caliber of 6 inches, 152mm is mentioned, the caliber of 6.1 inches, 155mm is substituted there for. Yep, it's a 155 gun world. There are complications coming ahead. Now, one of the interesting personalities in this treaty is, of course, King George V himself got to be far more involved. And he really did. He had seen the folly of war, he had seen all the hubris, he'd lost cousins. A cousin had lost his throne. Probably a cousin he'd quite like to lose his throne earlier. Possibly the family dimwit, but you know, these things happen. He had another cousin who was nice but dim, at least. The other was nasty but dim, but the other one of them was nice but dim. Had lost his throne in his life. I do sometimes wonder whether George V ever privately thought that was probably the wrong way around. Both losing thrones, I can understand that, but the wrong one ended up getting dead. From George V's perspective, he is a impassioned personality. However, he is also inherently conservative. And he is inherently not, whilst he's going to try and guide, and to an extent support the Navy, he is not going to try and push and mold the government. And he wants peace. He wants peace. There is some good journal articles, some good books nowadays appearing on the emotional scarring of the upper classes in World War One, and it's one of those things which is, how to put it, has not been in vogue to really study. They themselves don't tend to want to study it, and quite a lot of historians in especially the 1970s and 1980s just didn't want to focus on it. And I can understand why. There is a sense that there were a lot of people going off to die, and you know, this is a very small group proportionally wise, and they're a very in many ways a very privileged group. But you also have to remember that for people like King George V, prior to World War One, he'd had many friends, and they'd had sons, and huge numbers of those sons hadn't come back. Entire families had their sons, the male parts of the line, wiped out. The most horrifically high casualty rates in the British forces in World War One were junior officers and junior NCOs, because they were usually at the front leading things. The highest casualty rate per percent, as a percentage of the population that had that role, is amongst subalterns, junior lieutenants, and corporals. Those are the groups which get massacred. And yes, a lot of the junior officers are grammar school boys. A lot of the junior officers are men who've worked their way up. But there's also a disturbingly high proportion of people who are put in those roles because they come from the right background and they want to do their bit for the country, and they go through the bare amount of training, but they have the right accent, they have a mustache to cover their age and make them get killed. They get mown down. And you have to remember the leadership of the country that comes back from World War One, the leadership of the country that's leading not just Britain, but France, America, but France and Britain especially, are traumatized by that. Their friends, their godsons, their nephews, their sons themselves, their own sons, have been destroyed. They themselves have had some experience of the war. And this affects their approach to it. But the trouble is, there's also other powers in the world who haven't been so similarly affected, or have interpreted that loss differently. Germany at this point is seeing the rise of the stab in the back myth, which is going through its third or fourth evolution during the Weimar Republic. And the Weimar Republic is not doomed to fall, but it certainly is in a precarious position, somewhat thanks to these treaties. Japan is under the impression it won World War One. It didn't lose that many people. It did all its operations were fairly successful. It was a fairly glorious war as far as they were concerned. They don't understand what this whole trembling lip stuff going on is. So this is the trouble when you are negotiating treaties still dealing with that mindset. Because you think other people are going to be thinking the same as you, and they're not. So here's a 1936 treaty. No aircraft carrier shall exceed 23,000 tons standard displacement, or carry a gun of a caliber exceeding 6.1 inch. If the armament of any aircraft carrier includes guns exceeding 5.25 inch in caliber, total number of guns carried which exceed that caliber shall not be more than 10. Aircraft carriers are surface vessels of war, whatever their displacement, designed or adapted primarily for the purpose of carrying and operating aircraft at sea. Ouch. Aircraft carriers can be replaced after 20 years of service. This is the great fun. If you can, this is copied word for word from the text of the treaty. I would just like to point this out. The category of aircraft carriers is divided into two subcategories as follows: vessels fitted with a flight deck from which aircraft can take off, or on which aircraft can land from the air. Vessels not fitted with a flight deck as described in A above. Seaplane carriers? Now included in tonnage? You have a burning desire for HMS Pegasus to be included in the numbers of the fleet? Or what are you doing to the Japanese again? The 1936 London Treaty is just Mugende for being weird. This is Ark Royal, 22,000 long ton standard. That's a lot of ship you can get for 22,000 ton standard. It's a lot of ship. Imagine what you could produce for a little bit more. So, what do we do? Well, it's an equitable ratio time. And I'm going to go back to the 10, 10, 7, 4, 4 ratio as I proposed for Washington 1. Mainly because that's the Equitable Treaty, which, frankly, Japan would have accepted. And it provides the measure of superiority still, which the US and UK required. And it's kind of interesting. It also is mathematically quite easy for me. And I am historian enough to admit that going with easy maths is never something which is not something I don't like. Now, there are still issues though. New construction, it's helpful, they're economic boost for the UK and the US. There's also the fact that would attract me. While Japan is putting resources into new production, they cannot be devoting those resources to conquering other countries. Yes, you might turn around and say, but then they will have more resources to go and conquer other countries. They could do. But the trouble is, men, steel, and money all cost. And if you're doing a major shipbuilding program, as the Japanese will admit themselves, you can very easily and very quickly bankrupt your country. Also, and I say this with coming from the nicest possible place I can. If you want to avoid your opponent pulling out of the treaty and surprising you with the largest ships known to mankind, you'd better make it so that they can actually build some ships, which are within the treaty limits. What would this do? It would buy time. How much time? Who knows? But it would buy time. This was the Washington Treaty. Individual limit, 27,000 tons. Gun caliber limit, 8-inch. Average ratio, that. Oh. Ships allowed by tonnage, RN5, USN5, IGN3, Marine Nationale and Regia Marina 2.2. And 33,000 tons. Now, here is the interesting thing, because many people turn around and go, wow, courageous and glorious, they're the equivalent of Lexington and Saratoga. Because they're all the big conversions. 24,210 long tons. They might well be the equivalents. In fact, I do agree they are the British equivalents. But someone in Britain forgot they could build another 10,000 tons, or decided that they were going to go for a third carrier. Which doesn't surprise me, because the British do keep prioritising numbers over size. They want as many carriers as they can that are viable, so that they can have them operating in the space they need. This is HMS Illustrious. Armoured hangar carrier. 23,000 long tons. A nice ship. A good ship. So, Illustrious carries 23,000 tons, but 1,000 tons more than Ark Royal in standard, but carries less aircraft because, of course, she has armor. Now, one of the things driving the British development of aircraft carriers in this period, and I have covered it in my PhD thesis, which is not out yet, but hopefully will be out soon, is the fact that they are basically building their carriers around concepts. And they're concepts of fleet operations. And you have strike carriers, which are supposed to be built around having an air group, and are supposed to do things like Taranto. They're built for that, because attacking the enemy fleet in harbour has been a big thing for the Royal Navy from the very beginning of time. Copenhagening is not just a verb for the Royal Navy. Copenhagening is a way of life. It is life. Anyway, leaving that to one side, they did also notice that they were going to be operating, if they were operating anywhere, in the Far East or in the Mediterranean. Now, both of those present unique issues. In the Far East, they're the other side of the world from their industrial base and their support, and therefore their infrastructure and support it. So they need carriers which they can easily repair. and that are fairly survivable, because otherwise, when they get hit, carriers which, as the British experienced with Ben Maisheri, etc., are very large mobile bombs. They can pretty much go up. Well, if you want to maintain your fleet operating in the Far East or the outside world from your infrastructure base for any length of time, you'd better make it survivable and you'd better make it easy to repair. Metal is easier to repair than wood, as far as the British are concerned. You can store metal in the Far East far easier than you can store wood. You can keep somewhere fairly dry far easier than you can keep the humidity out of wood. And then you've got the Mediterranean, where, as far as the British are concerned, you cannot get away from enemy air bases. You just can't. In the central Mediterranean, the Italians, this is no surprise, but the order of British likelihood of threats in the 1920s and 1930s goes Japan, then Italy, then Germany. Okay? Mussolini comes around before Hitler does, and he starts calling the Mediterranean Mare Nostrum from the beginning. Japan, they are pointing guns at each other regularly. Again, please go see my Tsingtao series if you haven't seen that already. That, January 1939 is not the first time they've been pointing guns at each other. They are the higher threat as far as the Royal Navy is concerned. And then you've got Germany coming up the rear, which are doing a massive rearmament program, but are nowhere near complete, are moving along, and it's something the British are having to consider. But as far as the Royal Navy is concerned in terms of threats, they are a future threat that is emerging that they will try and counter. The Italians are an existing threat astride their main supply route to the Far East, where they're a major threat. The only Tier 2 Navy in the world exists. So, this was the Equitable Washington Treaty I proposed. 27,000 tons is fair and sensible, using the precedent of cruiser standards. However, 20,000 tons is in relation to 35,000 tons of capital ships, and with Hood capital ships being limited to 42,000 tons, using Hood as the basis, under the Equitable Washington proposal, again, please go see the video if you want more about those details, the large conversion proposal being 33,000 tons. So I made the limit 33,000 tons, and I made this ratio and worked it through for that. And that seemed a fairly good idea to me. However, the largest carriers in service by 1930 are not. Well, they're not courageous and glorious. Commissioned in 1927, both of them, Lexington and Saratoga displace roughly 36,000 long tons, and that's 37,000 tons normal metric tons. I know I put long tons for everyone else, but for this one I wanted the emphasis of the 37. I'm cheating a little, but 36,000 tons. Now, theoretically, they're 33,000 long ton as standard. That is, they are the limit. However, they use a further 3,000 tons, which they are supposed to be allowed for. Well, they've basically claimed an allowance for making them more. How do I put this? Providing extra torpedo defenses and AA defenses and all those things went in to allow them to go to 36,000 long tons. These are very big ships. And there's nothing wrong with that. The Americans have gone for the best carrier they can build, which is fine. But that means you have to start thinking about the other carriers under construction and what's fair and what's equitable. And again, you could turn around and go at this point, you know what, everyone, look, America, we're going to say what you've done is right and is fine. We're going to make it equitable. We're going to make everyone's limit 36,000 tons for carriers. And you're going to be allowed 10 of them, which is 360,000 tons. And you're going to be allowed to build light fleet carriers of up to 15,000 tons. And you can use up to 2/3 of your displacement for fleet carriers, as long as the remaining third is for light fleet carriers. So you have 240,000 tons for roughly for fleet carriers and 120,000 tons for light fleet carriers. What will the British probably do with that? 8 30,000 ton carriers and 8 15,000 ton carriers. Probably. Maybe they try and go less. Maybe they try and go for a 24,000 ton carrier. If we consider what they built for, if you can imagine Ark Royal with an extra couple of thousand tons, or Illustrious with an extra 1,000 tons standard, what they could have got into them. Probably more aircraft for Illustrious, probably some armor for Ark Royal. It would be interesting, and it would certainly produce a very interesting model. And that would allow them, of course, 10 carriers. Maybe they go for 10, 12,000 ton light carriers. But the thing is, they wouldn't have all these ships in service by World War II. Please don't think I'm saying that they would magically have this as a fleet size. But if they're aiming for that as a fleet size, and they've got a 20-year service period, then they might well start a production of having a fleet carrier and a light fleet carrier into service alternately each year. So they've got a 20-year service life. So you have a large fleet carrier, then a light fleet carrier, a fleet carrier, then a light fleet, a fleet carrier, light fleet. And if you started that in 1930 and you've got them under production, they take, let's say, 2 years to build, you could have 1932, 34, 36, and 38 fleet carriers, 1933, maybe even 1931, actually, you could get a light fleet carrier, a light carrier through. So you could go 31, 33, 35, 37, 39. That would have been quite possible. But the London Treaties, as it boils down, are 1930, aircraft carriers can be built, no build battle carriers, can't carry a gun greater than 6.1 inch. Any ship built primarily to operate aircraft is an aircraft carrier. No aircraft carrier can be built smaller than 10,000 tons. You can, theoretically, grey area build it, but you're going to be in sufficient enough watching mode that you're going to be in trouble. And it's going to be included in your tonnage. The whole thing is, under the Washington Treaty, anything built below 10,000 tons wasn't included in your tonnage. Now it's going to be part of your tonnage, so it's not really viable to surge out and build them all. 1936, limited to 23,000 tons. Go Illustrious class, you're bang on it. Guns exceeding 5.25 inch in caliber shall not be more than 10, which is kind of interesting because that means you've got roughly 5 twin mounts. Which is probably why the British end up going with a 4.5. Well below 5.25, and they can put 8 twin mounts. Aircraft carriers only serve 20 years. That's useful. So, this is, of course, the issue which is started at this point. Ryuja, which is 10,400 long tons in standard. Yeah, this is the thing that everyone's worried about. Japan building small carriers and surging them out. Japan would probably have claimed that was 10,000 long ton standard, or within the margin of error to be included as the 10,000 ton. She'd end up chronically top heavy and all sorts of issues of operation. But the thing is, because they were trying to build a fleet carrier, not an escort carrier, but she's still useful. So what do you do? Would be an Equitable London Treaty. Well, for starters, we'll establish the 10-7-4-4 ratio. As said, that helps the Japanese feel safe. The thing is, the intelligence that the British and the Americans had both pointed that as something that Japan wanted, desired, and would make them feel happier. You could have probably done it and given them that and then got away with other things. and Japan would have gone back thinking with it as a victory, and you could have actually won in other areas which would have been far more useful. Individual carriers. Most recent ships constructed are Lexington and Saratoga, were bigger than 33,000 tons. Honest, 36,000 tons. Those are long tons, of course, but that's what I'm working in. So that should be limited to all. But it should be limited to apply to all carriers. But if we're just talking about new builds, if we're saying, look, this is for ships which are built which are not new, therefore upgrades, repairs, and all those things, we'll say 31,000 tons. I was going to go with 30. Was tempted by 32, decided to go with 31, and the reason I went with 31,000 tons was because honestly I was working out some of the maths and working out what it would be like and what the scenario would be, and the 33,000 tons were to 27,000 tons were a 6,000 ton differential, and I decided that they'd go for a 5,000 ton differential, and that's mainly because of some of the debates that were going on at point to how much of the differential was down to the tonnage versus the actual design and the new being able to build a new ship and the level of the Lexington, etc., and Saratoga conversion, because they could go right down. They didn't have to. They were basically building ships which were almost new ships because they, unlike Courageous and Glorious, which had to be basically cut down and then built up, and Furious, which went through its myriad of stages of conversion of generous fun. The Lexington and Saratoga builds were fairly contiguous and sensible in that they weren't that far along in the battle cruiser build that they couldn't just go down and then build up. Limiting 6.1-inch guns, it's not going to matter to anyone other than the USN, and frankly, considering they've just churned out a pair of 36,000 ton carriers, they are going to have to accept that one. And honestly, it helps dropping them down to from 8-inch guns. Ships be considered over age and able to be replaced in 20 years from first launch. Yeah, I can work with that one. No one's going to complain too much. Total tonnage remaining at 135,000 tons, or 5 27,000 ton aircraft carriers, is hard to justify in a 10 to 7 world. You really can't justify in a 10 to 7 world. Now, there are other options, especially if you're going to go for, well, there's a range of carrier sizes we can build. They don't all have to be 27,000 tons, so we could set it up as this or that. But I decided to go with a 10 because I think that would work with the ratio system, especially as the ratio I've done with the capital ships upgrades it to 20 capital ships. Because again, I don't see anyone dropping those down to 10. So the only option to go from 15 is up to 20. 31,000 tons per ship, that allows 310,000 tons overall. Again, you don't want a mass build. And again, the maximum you can have on the construction point is a fifth of the total tonnage. So, that being said, what does it start to look like? Well, this is once again in my 2-year building cycles, okay? So these are all 2-year building cycles. These are not these are not being built in a single year. These are being built over a 2-year period. And again, my theory was between 30 and 32, you build a carrier. I've put the Royal Navy working it out at roughly what can we get 12 carriers built to a tonnage of, the free fleet scenario, and that fits what I think the Royal Navy would build. They are all significantly larger, sufficiently larger, I should say, than Illustrious and Ark Royal, that they could, in many ways, avoid the necessary of having a strike carrier, fleet carrier paradigm. Illustrious class being the fleet carrier, Ark Royal being the strike carrier, one for sort of Toronto-style operations, and the Alpha Strike if the Admiral orders it. So one's basically the Admiral's personal artillery, and one's for the fleet operations, providing strike, providing scout, providing spotting, providing fighter defense of the fleet as it's moving and engaging, and operating in places like the Mediterranean or the vast majority of the carriers in any Far East deployment. Basically, to protect things like the strike carrier, which are all orientated around their aircraft. So you could either go for an even bigger strike carrier, or you could go for a ship which is armored enough, but has still got the air group of the Ark Royal. I think, myself, that is what the British would end up going with. I think the British didn't like the division. They didn't like it. And I think they would go, because no one likes it. Yes, the Americans will probably build far bigger carriers with even more aircraft, and that's fine if you're aiming is to fight a Pacific War. That's the sensible option to do. That is the right, correct thing, and produces the best carriers for the US. So they could well start building 31,000 ton standard ton ships, which, can you imagine a Yorktown on that design? And also, this is the thing, the advantage is you probably don't get things like the Wasp being built. They're probably all built to a revised Yorktown design, which is much bigger. British going for 12 carriers, they're going to be roughly 25,800 tons each carrier. That does leave you a bit of tonnage left over. But to be fair, as they're going to be, to an extent, individual designs, they can probably afford it. And some of that tonnage will be played around with in the individual designs. And, yeah. Again, crucially, if we think about it in terms of 1939, as the build-up point, we could have as many as 8 carriers in service. New carriers in service. There's also the fact, and I will keep emphasizing this, if you have construction of this level going on, you have a far stronger industrial base to rearm from, so you can actually get more ships into service more quickly. That's what construction helps. But also, you have a far stronger force with which to deter your opponents. And again, if Britain is building these ships, Germany's got to turn around and go, well, the level that they feel comfortable going to war versus France or going to war versus Britain races up. They don't want superior. They don't think they're going to get superiority numbers, but they want enough numbers that they can't be easily swatted aside. That's their theory. Now, the reality of air power does add metrics to that, but no one's quite sure of that until war actually happens. There are lots of theories, there's lots of ideas going around, there's a lot of people having lots of promises. But rather like with currently what's going on, this is being filmed in May 2022, of course. Currently in Ukraine, where suddenly people are going, well, hang on, UAVs can provide all this information, and these are civilian, small little drones, and they're providing every trooper with all this information and all this stuff going on. It's amazing. There have been theories going around it for a while. Now, some of those theories have been proved true. Some of the theories appeared not to have been proved true, but you're not sure whether they're not being proved true because of the current state of technology, the realities of the context and of the nuances of the conflict being fought, or because they're actually just not going to actually work out that way. You don't know. You don't know until you're fighting the war. And there's always going to be a level of conservatism in your force estimates. Because there has to be. Because here is the thing. Militaries are the organizations which can least afford to bet the house on the unknown, because they literally are betting the house. Any other part of government, barring the police, the fire service, the ambulance service, the health, probably a healthcare system, and the armed forces. They cannot afford to bet everything on an untried system, because if they fail, the state ceases to exist or people die rather quickly. That's not good. This is the Enterprise. 19,800 tons long standard. 19,800 long ton standard. Imagine what the US Navy could have built with more tonnage. Even if they did decide, and this is the thing, they could have decided, both services could have decided to still build 20,000 ton ships. But they would have been able to build up to 15 of them. Or they could have built 22,000 ton ships to try and get, well, 14? Instead of 12. There are options there. 14 or Ark Royals for the Royal Navy would not be a disappointing thing for the Royal Navy. They'd be really quite happy with 14 Ark Royals. So tonnage allows freedom. Would the US Congress have freed up the funds and suddenly be building a lot more ships? No. But would these ships have been probably better, have individually been a lot better? More than likely, because guess what? The US Navy would also have liked some armor. You know how I know that? Because look at what ends up turning up with the Midway class. Now, I don't think they'd have gone full armored carrier illustrious style, but I think they'd have had far better protected ships. Even than the Yorktowns, they'd have probably still had, if not bigger air groups, but they'd have had more protection as well, which would have made them more survivable. And remember again, this is one of the points I want to make about the treaty system. Britain and America have the largest maritime infrastructure and industries. They are the ones who are most able to afford to do build up and to build up to the maximum. They are the ones industrially and economically capable of doing that. So any increase in treaty allowance disproportionately benefits those two powers, because they can get there a lot quicker than Japan can build up to its 7 ship ratio. Japan would have to cease all other construction to be able to do that rapidly. And even then, it would take years. There is a reason most of the Kantai Kessen doesn't exist when we're talking in 1930. Sorry. Well, it's an interesting option in the ratios. The interesting option is, as I mentioned before, Germany. So, you could invite Germany, you could even invite the Soviet Union, and make them tier 2, well, let's be honest. Tier 1, US and UK. Tier 2, Japan. Tier 3, France and Italy. You could offer, see if the Soviet Union will accept Tier 3 or Tier 4 with Germany. That'd be 2 aircraft carriers and 4 battleships each. Now, for the Soviet Union, 4 battleships might be an improvement, considering that's what they've got. But they probably want more. They would probably want to be France level, which mean 8 battleships and 4 carriers. But to be fair, that would be brilliant for Britain and America. Why? Because if you allow Germany to build to 2 and the Soviet Union to build to 4, well, the Soviet Union's eastern ones are going to be sitting in the Baltic, facing off against the German force, which is going to be the same size of them, as long as it's 50% of the Russian force. Probably it's going to be less, because the Russians are going to divide it between the Baltic, the Black Sea, and the Northern and the Pacific Fleet. because they might have 3 battleships in the Baltic and 2 carriers, or 1 carrier, or no carriers, perhaps. Then they've got their whatever their forces in the Black Sea, and then they've got their force in the Far East. And in the Far East, that would immediately provide something, especially if you were helping the Soviet Union in some respects, make sure they get there. That would provide immediately a distraction for Japan. Now, yes, Japan does end up fighting wars against the Soviet Union quite regularly, and in 1939, the reason why Stalin waits to invade Poland isn't because he's suddenly anxious and supportive of the Polish having an independent sovereign nation state and doesn't want to see him quashed by the German jackboot. No, it's because he's finishing off his war against Japan. It's a subtle and it's a sick policy, you can say. You could say you're arming evil dictatorships in order to balance each other, absorb each other, and distract another major power who is a potential problem. But as real politics goes, it's actually quite sensible. And Germany, at this point, of course, is not Nazi Germany. Germany is the Weimar Republic. And if you're suddenly allowing the Weimar Republic to build up a strong navy, that could actually reinforce the Weimar Republic and strengthen them. It could. And France would still have twice the fleet that Germany does. And if they ended up in a war versus Italy, well, in the nicest way, you have UK on your side. And the UK has, well, a 5-2 ratio going on with Italy. That's quite useful for the British. So there are options here going on that could actually be done and would have actually made the world arguably more secure. It would have caused interesting consternation in the Soviet Union because they could have ended up having to start building up ships, which would have been interesting if they started in 1950. Again, wouldn't have been ready. That fleet would not have been ready for World War II if World War II still took place in 1939, which it arguably probably would not. Germany, well, those same politicians which lost us a fleet and stabbed us in the back at Versailles have got us a new fleet, which we're now building, and we're full of pride, and we've got these battleships, and we're even going to have aircraft carriers. And yes, you can say there's a problem for the British if they have aircraft carriers in World War II. There is. But again, they will have 2. And as I've said before, 1 is a white elephant, 2 is usually available, 3 is available, 4 is a guaranteed capability. I.e., 1 is at sea, and 1 is available in case anything happens to the one at sea to take over its role. 1 more is probably in long-term refit or long or short term. Well, the other 2 are probably in mixture of long-term refit, training, transits, short-term refit, all the other things which ships have to go through in their life, dry docking in order to be repainted because salt water is once again corroding their very souls and their hulls. So, you're not exactly giving them a real capability if you give them 4 capital ships and 2 carriers. You're really not. But you then have a treaty limitation you can hold them to. You don't need to have the Anglo-German naval treaty, which causes issues with France later in the 1930s. You don't need to have any of the other issues which come up. And, as said, give the Soviet Union some ships as well, get them involved, you distract the Japanese. And you can provide someone for the Germans to focus on. It's a win-win-win. I know, I'm talking. Everyone's going to go, Alex, this is an equitable treaty. You're not supposed to be being evil as well, but you can produce an equitable treaty which is fair to everyone and is also evil. The trouble is they go for an inequitable treaty to try and achieve the same ends that you could achieve with an equitable treaty. Because they don't think it through, is my view, but also because they are stuck in a particular alleyway of thought. And that is the advantage I have. I do have, let's be honest, 90 odd years and a lot of time and a lot of good, very excellent historians to read and go back and look over these things with. But I also have I have the hindsight advantage. But even then, I'd like to think I would have had this sensible idea that going for a crushing win and a crushing win round 2 in 1930 is not going to sow the seeds of peace. USS Wasp, 14,700 long ton standard. See what I mean about 15,000 tons? You could produce something very pretty. So, I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you found it interesting. We have a lot of videos coming up. We have the Pensacola class coming up tomorrow, and I'm doing them first, but on the 13th of June, it's going to be Introduction to US Cruiser Strategy in 1920s and 1930s, and then 14th of June is Giacomo class. So I hope you've enjoyed you enjoyed those, and yeah, I hope you enjoyed all those videos that have been coming up, and I hope you've been finding it as interesting as I have to explore what could have been an equitable treaty and what the benefits versus the drawbacks could have been of such a treaty. Again, I will return you to this chart quickly. I do not expect ships to be rapidly and massively built just because they have the treaty allowance. They're not going to operate that way. And you're still going to have some ships have to be paid off to maintain tonnage below the 310,000 ton limits. I think possibly Furious would survive longer. I think because you could just about get away with it. But I also want you to sit there and think, hang on. Britain has 6 aircraft carriers in 1930. They have the most carriers of anyone in the world. They have 7 very shortly after that. So Britain is not exactly against building aircraft carriers. They just normally have a treaty tonnage limit of 135,000 tons to deal with. The moment I'm new building a ship of 25,800 tons, I've gone up to 145,000 tons. And it's not as if Britain couldn't build that. The Implacable class will be 23,460 tons in standard. Again, imagine what an extra couple of thousand tons allows you to build. That's their design standard. Thank you for watching. There will be lives while I'm in Canada. I hope I've managed to do a couple. I do one at least by now, if not 2, and mainly to say thank you, but also to update you on what we're doing in terms of what we've seen, show you some of the pictures, hopefully show you some of the footage if I can get it to work. So thank you very much. I'm going to be relying on the camera I'm taking with me. Theoretically, it can also be plugged into the laptop and work as this the sort of webcam. So we'll cross fingers on that. And also the radio mics, theoretically, they can work with a computer. And I will be hopefully to use those as well. So all these things are hopeful crossing fingers for when we're going around Canada. Thank you very much for watching, and thank you. And because I didn't manage to do the question out loud, I'm going to do it again. And you're all going to think, hang on, you went silent. Did you go silent at the end? No, don't worry, I didn't. I know I pressed that button and I'd forgotten I pressed it. So, the question, and I hadn't forgotten it, is this. What carrier fleet would you build? Not just if you're Britain, not just if you're America, but if you're Russia, if you were France, if you're Italy, if you were Germany, under this treaty, what would you build? What kind of carrier force would you build? What do you think you'd look like? And if you do designs, send them to me on Discord. I love seeing those designs, and as I've done before, I will put them in some of the discussions at some point. I will put them in a presentation at some point to discuss them. But I'm really interested. I'm really always excited to hear what you think, because it's another way of making this kind of like the seminar experience, and that's what I equate most of the lives, most discussions to in my mind. I equate it to the seminar experience when I'm leading seminars at university, and I love the interplay and I love the discussions with students then, and I love the interplay and I love the discussions with you. It's always a pleasure, and it's one of the reasons why I teach at university level, and one of the reasons why I like doing YouTube and I like doing public lectures and those things. The people there are there because they've chosen to be, not because someone's forced them. Take care, and thank you very much for watching.